She was supposed to be grateful. That was the arrangement. That was the whole point. When Silas Granger rode into Laramie to collect the woman who'd answered his advertisement, he expected someone quiet, someone reasonable, someone who understood that life on the Wyoming high plains was not a subject for negotiation. He was wrong on every count. Ingrid Halvorsen stepped off the Denver and Rio Grande with one trunk, a leather satchel that looked older than she was, and an expression that said she had already sized up the situation and found it wanting. She was 24 years old, with hay-colored hair pinned back under a practical hat and gray eyes that didn't blink when the wind hit her. She looked at Silas the way a person looks at a fence line, checking it for gaps before deciding whether it's worth crossing. "You're Granger," she said, not a question. He confirmed it. She picked up her own trunk before he could offer, "Which way is the wagon?" That was how it started. Not with any of the pleasantries Silas had half-heartedly rehearsed on the ride down. Not with the awkward handshake he'd imagined, or the tentative conversation about weather and distance. Just a woman who already knew her own mind, already moving in the direction of the wagon, already 3 steps ahead of the moment. Silas Granger was 36 years old and had been running the Granger spread alone for 4 years, ever since his father's lungs gave out and left him with 800 acres. A small herd of Herefords, 2 aging ranch hands, and a silence so complete it had started to feel like a second presence in the house. He wasn't a man who talked about loneliness. He was a man who wrote an advertisement in the Cheyenne Weekly Sun and waited to see who answered. Ingrid had answered in January. It was now late April, and the snowpack was still heavy on the Laramie Range. The ride back to the ranch took 3 hours. They didn't talk much. Ingrid looked at the country the way people look at things they are seriously considering. Not admiring, not dismissing, just taking inventory. The Sage Flats. The ribbon of creek running pewter-colored under the cloud cover. The distant line of the mountains still white to the timber. "How many head?" she finally asked. "About 200. "Water right solid?" Silas glanced at her. "Solid enough?" "That's not a yes." He admitted it wasn't exactly a yes, and explained about the upstream situation with a rancher named Aldous Finch, who had been diverting creek flow for 3 seasons running and had the county commissioner's ear in ways that Silas did not. Ingrid listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Have you put it in writing to the commissioner?" He hadn't. She didn't say anything to that. She just looked back out at the country, and Silas had the distinct feeling he had failed a test he hadn't known he was taking. The ranch house was large by the standards of the territory. 2 stories, with a covered porch and a kitchen big enough to cook for a crew. Silas had cleaned it the day before with the particular desperation of a man who had not cleaned it in months. He'd stacked things. He'd moved piles from one location to another. He was not sure the result was an improvement. Ingrid walked through the house the way she'd looked at the country. Systematic, she opened the larder and noted what was there. She checked the stove damper. She looked at the water situation, the root cellar, the state of the winter stores. She didn't comment on any of it while she was looking, which Silas found more unnerving than if she had. That evening, at supper, she said, "You're low on salt pork. And the corner post on the south fence by the draw is rotted through. I saw it on the way in. I know about the post. Do you have the timber for it? I'll get to it." "When?" He put down his fork. "I've been running this ranch by myself for 4 years. I think I know when to get to things." Ingrid looked at him steadily. "I'm not saying you don't. I'm saying I want to know the answer." There was a difference there. Silas could see it. He wasn't sure yet whether he appreciated it. He told her he planned to get to the post after the calving push was through, which would be another 2 weeks. She nodded, filed that away somewhere, and passed him the biscuits. That was their first week. Silas kept expecting it to get easier, the way a new brute eventually stops biting at the heel. Instead, it stayed strange in ways he couldn't quite account for. Ingrid was not difficult. She was efficient, competent, and direct in a way that he'd started to realize was simply her manner and not a form of criticism. She cooked well. She kept the house in a state of organization that made Silas feel obscurely ashamed of the 4 years that preceded her arrival. But she was also not what he had pictured. The woman in his imagination had been grateful in a softer way. more accommodating to the rhythms of the place, the silences, the long stretches of nothing that ranching required. Ingrid seemed to have her own rhythms entirely, and they were not slow ones. She'd been there 8 days when she asked to ride with him on the morning check. He handed her the chestnut mare, not because the mare was easy, but because she was honest, and he wanted to see how Ingrid sat a horse. She sat it well. Better than well. She had the kind of seat that comes from a childhood spent in the saddle, and when the mare spooked at a pheasant in the brush, Ingrid just pushed her forward without drama. "Where are you from exactly?" Silas asked. "South Dakota. Small spread near the Moreau River. My father ran cattle until I was 18, then the bank ran them instead." She said it the way people say things they've already finished grieving over. "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." She looked across the flats to where 3 cows had separated from the main group. "Those 3. That one on the left is limping." He'd already seen it. He hadn't said anything yet. He noticed that she hadn't made a production of noticing it first. It was the small things, he was starting to understand, that told you who a person was. The real trouble came with Aldous Finch. It came, as these things do on the high plains, without ceremony. One morning in late May, Silas rode the creek and found the flow cut to less than half what it should have been. The upstream diversion channel had been expanded, dug wider and redirected more aggressively. It was deliberate, recent work. There were boot prints in the mud and the fresh raw smell of turned earth. He came back to the house quieter than he'd left it. Ingrid looked at his face and didn't ask right away. She put coffee in front of him and waited, which was a form of patience he hadn't expected from her and was unexpectedly grateful for. When he explained, she listened to the whole thing. Then she said, "What happens to the herd if the creek runs dry through July?" "They don't make it through July." She was quiet. "Then I'm going to write the letter to the county commissioner. Tonight. You sign it." "Ingrid, you said yourself you haven't put it in writing. That means legally you haven't made a formal objection. Everything Finch is doing is on record somewhere, and your silence is too." She wasn't heated about it. She said it the way you describe a fence post. "Here's the problem. Here's what you do about it. Will you let me write it?" He said yes. He wasn't sure why exactly, except that she was right and he knew it. The letter went out the following week. The county commissioner did not respond for 3 weeks, which Silas took as a signal of how things were likely to go. Ingrid took it as a signal to write a second letter, this one copied to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne and the water adjudicator whose name she had found in the Laramie newspaper's legal notices. "How do you know about water adjudicators?" Silas asked. "My father lost the ranch partly because he didn't know about them," she said. "I made a point of learning." In June, Aldous Finch rode over. He was a big man, broad across the chest, with the kind of comfortable authority that comes from having more land than your neighbors for long enough that you forget there was ever any other arrangement. He rode with 2 of his men, which was more than you needed for a friendly call, and fewer than you needed for an honest threat. It was meant to land somewhere in between. Silas met him in the yard. Ingrid came out of the house and stood on the porch, and Finch looked at her with the particular surprise of a man who had heard about a mail order arrangement and pictured someone decorative and peripheral. "Didn't know you'd gotten married, Granger," Finch said. "It's recent," Silas said. Finch said he'd heard about the letters, said there was no need to involve Cheyenne in what was essentially a neighborly matter of water management, said he was sure they could come to some arrangement man to man about the diversion. "The arrangement," Ingrid said from the porch, "is the prior appropriation doctrine. Mr. Granger's water rights are senior by 14 years. That's not a negotiation, that's the law." Finch looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Silas in the way men look at other men when they want to signal that the woman speaking has said something that should be gently corrected. Silas didn't correct it. "She's not wrong," he said. Finch's 2 men shifted in their saddles. Finch himself kept his face pleasant, the way a man keeps his face pleasant when he's deciding something. He said they'd see how it played out. He said Cheyenne was far away. He said the summer was long. Then he turned his horse and rode back out the gate with his men behind him, and the yard was quiet again. "He'll push the fence next," Ingrid said. Silas thought so too. He pushed it in July. 3 sections of the north fence line went down in the night. And in the morning, 30 of Silas's cattle had drifted onto Finch land. Getting him back involved the better part of a day in the conversation with Finch's foreman that left Silas's hand shaking on the ride home. Though he kept him steady enough while he was having it. The two ranch hands, Ove and Marcus, were good men, but they were older and they'd been watching Finch's operation grow for years, with the particular resignation of people who have seen how these things go. When Silas told them about the fence, they nodded. When Ingrid came into the barn while they were talking and started asking about the property line markers and whether they'd been surveyed recently, they looked at each other. The woman's got a point, Ove said afterward to Silas without fanfare. When's the last time anybody actually walked that line? Nobody could remember. Ingrid organized the survey. She found the name of a surveyor in Laramie through the county recorder's office, wrote the letter, arranged the payment from the household account, which she now managed with a competence that Silas had initially resisted and now found he depended on, and had the man out to the property within 2 weeks. The survey found 3 markers that had been moved. Not shifted by weather. Moved deliberately, by someone who knew what they were doing and had been doing it incrementally for long enough that the cumulative drift was significant. They filed the survey with the county. They filed it with the Territorial Land Office. The Water Adjudicator's office in Cheyenne, which had been slow to respond, suddenly responded. It was the kind of fight that wasn't settled in a day or even a season. But it was the kind of fight that Silas had not known how to begin before Ingrid came. He'd known he was losing ground, literally, and he'd known that Finch's connections made direct confrontation dangerous. What he hadn't seen was that the answer was paper. Records. The slow, unglamorous work of documentation and formal objection that Finch, accustomed to informal arrangements, had never expected from a cattle rancher who mostly kept to himself. Ingrid had seen it on the ride from Laramie when she'd first asked about the water rights, and he'd said, solid enough, and she'd known that wasn't a yes. She'd been thinking about it since then. There was a night in August when the heat broke late and they sat on the porch after supper. And the air smelled like rain coming down off the mountains. Silas had been mending a bridle. Ingrid was writing something in the small journal she kept. They'd been sitting in silence for 20 minutes, which was no longer an uncomfortable silence. Could I ask you something? Silas said. Yes. Why did you answer the advertisement? She was quiet for a moment. Not evasive. She wasn't evasive by nature. Just considering. I wanted land, she said. Not someone else's, my own, or at least somewhere that could be. She paused. That's an honest answer. Is it the one you wanted? It's the one I needed, he said. She looked at him. Why did you place it? Same reason, mostly. He turned the bridle over in his hands. I'd run this place alone long enough to know I wasn't running it right. It was the first honest thing he'd said to her that wasn't about cattle or fence lines or water rights. She seemed to recognize it as such. We're not running it right now either, she said, but we're closer. The calves born that spring were healthy. The water adjudicator ruled in Silas's favor in September, ordering Finch to restore the creek diversion to its original position and pay a penalty for each month of unlawful diversion going back 2 years. It wasn't everything. Finch's men still rode the boundary in ways that were technically legal and obviously pointed. The county commissioner still wasn't friendly. But the ground had shifted, and Finch knew it, and Silas knew it, and perhaps more importantly, Finch's men knew it. Ove, who had been on the Granger spread for 11 years, told Silas one morning that the place felt different. Different how? Silas asked. Ove thought about it. Like somebody's watching it, he said. The good kind of watching. By October, they had a routine. Not the routine Silas had imagined in February when he was writing the advertisement. The imaginary accommodating woman folding herself into his existing life. Something harder-edged and more real. Ingrid checked the south pasture on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. Silas handled the creek and the north fence. They sat down together on Sundays and went over the accounts, which had been Ingrid's idea, and which had revealed 2 places where Silas had been paying more than necessary for supplies he could source locally for less. They argued, sometimes, about the timing of the hay sale, about whether to buy 2 more cows or put the money into fencing, about a leaking section of the barn roof that Silas wanted to patch and Ingrid wanted to replace. They argued the way people argue when they're both trying to solve the same problem from different angles. with some heat, but no cruelty. After the argument about the barn roof, which Ingrid won on the merits because the patch would not hold through another Wyoming winter, and they both knew it, Silas found himself thinking about what his father would have made of her. The old man had been a quiet person, patient and methodical, not given to sentiment. He would have respected the practical intelligence. He might have been unsettled by the directness at first. He would have come around. The winter came hard that year, as Wyoming winters do. In December, a storm came down out of Canada and sat over the Laramie Range for 6 days. The temperature dropped to 30 below and stayed there. 3 cows were lost in the first blow before they could get the herd under shelter. A section of the barn roof came down, not the section Ingrid had wanted to replace, which held, but an older section no one had evaluated closely enough. They worked through it. There was no other option. Silas and Ave and Marcus worked in shifts, and Ingrid worked alongside them without being asked, carrying hay in the dark at 5 in the morning, breaking ice on the water troughs twice a day, her breath coming in clouds in the lantern light. One night, during the worst of it, when the temperature had dropped again and the wind was hitting the barn walls like something that wanted in, Silas found Ingrid sitting on an overturned bucket between 2 cows that were unwell, talking to them in low Norwegian. Not sentimental, exactly. Practical in some way he couldn't quite name. The way you talk to a creature that can't understand the words but can hear that you're calm. He stood there a moment longer than he needed to before he went back to work. By January, they had lost 11 animals total. It was a hard number. It would have been harder without the 2 of them working it together. Silas knew that with the kind of knowledge that doesn't require stating, the kind that settles into you over months of shared difficulty until it simply becomes part of the way you understand your situation. Spring came late, as it had the year before. The creek ran high with snowmelt, and this year the water flowed onto Granger land the way it was supposed to, without Finch's diversion pulling it away. Ingrid walked the upper fence line in April when the ground was soft enough to inspect the post footings, and she found 2 that needed resetting before they became problems. She and Silas reset them together, working in the mud, and somewhere in the middle of it she said something that made him laugh. He couldn't afterward remember exactly what, and he realized that he hadn't laughed like that in a long time. Maybe years. The land office clerk who had handled the water adjudication sent a letter that spring asking if the situation had been satisfactorily resolved. Ingrid wrote back a thorough response that outlined the settlement terms, the compliance so far, and the outstanding issues that still warranted monitoring. She copied Silas on it and asked if he wanted to add anything. He read her letter and said he didn't think he needed to add a word. "You could add your name," she said. That was already going to happen. She smiled at that. She didn't smile constantly. She wasn't a person who used expression as currency, but when she did, it reached her eyes, and Silas had started to notice when it did and when it didn't. There were neighbors now. Not many. The nearest family was 9 miles off. A couple named Thorvaldsen who'd come up from Colorado and were struggling through their first Wyoming winter with more determination than resources. Ingrid had ridden over twice with supplies and stayed to help with the fence repair, and in return, Helen Thorvaldsen had come over in March and helped with the calving push in a way that made the whole thing go faster and easier. That was how it started. A second family, then the word spreading along the creek, then a loose network of people who helped each other because the land demanded it, and because Ingrid, it turned out, had a talent for community that she had never been able to exercise on her own. By summer, Silas had stopped thinking about the ranch as his. It wasn't a loss. It was more like a clarification. The place had always needed more than one person. He'd known that without being able to say it clearly, and now it was simply the case, and the knowing didn't require any further discussion. He said something like this to Ingrid one evening in late June, when the light was still holding at 9 o'clock the way it does in Wyoming summer, and the air smelled like grass and distant rain. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" "About this being yours too, legally, on paper." He'd looked into it. There were ways to do it. It wasn't complicated. She was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know I don't." Another pause. "All right," she said. It took a month to arrange. The lawyer in Laramie thought it was unusual but not unprecedented, drew up the documentation, And one Tuesday afternoon they rode into town and signed it and rode home and got back in time to help Marcus with a stuck calf that had been giving him trouble since noon. Nothing about the day was dramatic. The land was still the same land. The work was still the same work. The creek still ran where it was supposed to run, past the north pasture and the draw where the old cottonwoods grew, making the sound water makes when it's moving freely and no one is stopping it. That night after supper, Ingrid sat at the table with the account book, and Silas sat across from her mending a cinched strap, and the lamp threw yellow light over everything, and outside the Wyoming dark came down full and wide, and presented the way it only is out there, where there's enough space between people and the sky to see how large it actually is. Neither of them said anything for a long time. That was enough. After everything, the fence line arguments and the water adjudication and the 6-day storm and the long mud season and the neighbor who tested them and the land that had tested them had the land that had tested them harder, the quiet was not empty anymore. It was full of everything they'd built, and it was theirs. I keep thinking about the moment Ingrid picked up her own trunk before Silas could offer. That one small gesture told you everything about who she was and what this story was actually going to be about. Not a woman waiting to be taken care of, a woman who had already decided how she was going to move through the world, and was simply looking for solid ground to do it on. What struck me most, sitting with this story, is how cause and effect plays out so quietly in real life. Silas lost ground to Aldous Finch, not because he was weak, but because he was alone, and because he'd been alone long enough that he'd stopped seeing the gaps, the rotted fence post he knew about but hadn't gotten to. The water rights he called solid enough when they weren't. The letter to the county commissioner he'd never written. None of those things were catastrophic on their own. Together they added up to a ranch that was slowly being taken from him, piece by piece, in ways that looked almost accidental. That's how I think it actually works. The damage rarely comes all at once. It accumulates in the things we keep meaning to do and don't. The problems we acknowledge and then leave for later. The fights we avoid because we're not sure we can win them. Finch wasn't counting on Silas to fight back. He was counting on Silas to stay the same. What Ingrid brought wasn't just competence, though she had plenty of that. It was a particular kind of clear-eyed honesty that I think is rarer than most people realize. The kind that looks at a situation and describes it as it is, not as it's convenient to believe it is. She asked about the water rights on the first day. Not because she was being difficult, but because she'd learned, the hard way, what happens when those questions don't get asked early enough. Her father lost his ranch. She carried that knowledge forward and put it to use. That's not something that happens automatically. That's a choice, made deliberately, to turn a painful thing into a useful one. There's something in that I find genuinely worth sitting with. The difference between people who get knocked down by hard experience and people who come out of it sharper isn't luck, mostly. It's whether they're willing to understand what actually happened, and to carry that understanding without bitterness, making it too heavy to use. Silas had to do his own version of that. He had to be willing to hear, "That's not a yes" from someone he'd just met, and not shut down. He had to sign a letter he hadn't written himself, and stand behind it in front of a man who was accustomed to other men folding. Neither of those things came naturally to him. He did them anyway, which is the part that matters, not the ease of it. The doing. By the end, what they built wasn't just a functioning ranch. It was something harder to name. A way of facing things together that neither of them could have arrived at alone. The land was still difficult. The winters were still brutal. Finch was still out there, watching the boundary line, but they weren't facing any of it from a position of isolated stubbornness anymore. They were facing it with their eyes open, their records in order, and someone beside them who they'd actually earned the right to trust. I think that's what I'll carry from this one. Not the romance of it, though it earns that too. The simple, undramatic truth that the life you want is mostly built in the unglamorous moments. The letters that get written, the fence posts that get reset before they become disasters, the honest conversations that happen instead of the comfortable silences. One small act of integrity at a time, until one day you look up and realize the ground beneath you is finally solid.